Welcome back. I am Pemberton, and this is Book 2, Part 3. The generation that knew Joseph has died, and a fearful new king looks at the multiplying Hebrews and sees a threat. So begins the bondage, the hard labor, the bricks and the building, and at last the dreadful order to drown every Hebrew boy in the Nile. Into that terror a child is born, hidden, and set adrift on the river in a little ark of reeds, to be drawn out and raised, of all places, in Pharaoh's own palace. We follow this Moses through a chapter you will not find in your Bible: Josephus' tale of his war as an Egyptian general against the Ethiopians, then his flight into the desert of Midian, the well, the priest's daughters, and a marriage. And we come to the mountain, and the bush that burns and is not consumed, where a voice gives the shepherd the most frightening errand in history. Let us go on.
It happened that the Egyptians became soft and lazy about hard work, and gave themselves over to other pleasures, especially the love of gain. They also became very hostile toward the Hebrews, because they were touched with envy at their prosperity. When they saw how the nation of the Israelites flourished, and how they had already become eminent in wealth gained by their virtue and natural love of labor, they thought that Israel's increase was harmful to themselves. After a long time had passed, they forgot the benefits they had received from Joseph, especially since the crown had now come into another family. They became very abusive to the Israelites and devised many ways to afflict them. They ordered them to cut many channels for the river, and to build walls and ramparts for their cities, so they might restrain the river and keep its waters from stagnating when it overflowed its banks. They also set them to build pyramids, and by all this wore them out. They forced them to learn all kinds of mechanical arts and to accustom themselves to hard labor. They spent 400 years under these afflictions. The Egyptians and Israelites struggled against one another over which side would prevail. The Egyptians wanted to destroy the Israelites by these labors, while the Israelites wanted to endure them to the end. While the affairs of the Hebrews were in this condition, an occasion arose among the Egyptians that made them more anxious to extinguish our nation. One of the sacred scribes, who are very wise and truly foretelling future events, told the king that about this time a child would be born to the Israelites who, if he were raised, would bring down the Egyptian dominion and raise up the Israelites. He would excel all men in virtue and gain a glory remembered through all ages. The king feared this so much that, following this man's judgment, he commanded that every male child born to the Israelites be thrown into the river and destroyed. He also ordered the Egyptian midwives to watch the labors of the Hebrew women and observe what was born. These were the women appointed to serve as midwives for them, and because of their connection to the king, they would not disobey his commands. He further ordered that if any parents disobeyed him and dared to keep their male children alive, they and their families would be destroyed. This was a severe affliction for those who suffered it, not only because they were deprived of their sons, and as parents, were forced to assist in destroying their own children, but also because it seemed likely to lead to the extinction of their nation. With their children destroyed and themselves gradually dying off, the calamity would become very hard and without comfort. This was the miserable condition they were in. But no one can be too strong for God's purpose, even if he devises 10,000 subtle schemes against it. For the child whom the sacred scribe foretold was brought up and hidden from the observers appointed by the king, and the one who foretold him was not mistaken about the consequences of his preservation. These things came about in the following way. A man named Amram, one of the nobler Hebrews, was afraid for his whole nation, lest it should fail because there would be no young men raised up in the future. He was deeply troubled, especially because his wife was then pregnant, and he did not know what to do. So he turned to prayer to God and begged him to have compassion on men who had in no way transgressed the laws of his worship. He asked God to give them deliverance from the miseries they were then suffering, and to make their enemies' hopes for the destruction of their nation come to nothing. God had mercy on him and was moved by his supplication. He stood by him in his sleep and urged him not to despair of future favors. God said he did not forget their piety toward him, and would always reward them for it, just as he had formerly granted favor to their forefathers, and increased them from a few people into so great a multitude. He reminded Amram that when Abraham came alone out of Mesopotamia into Canaan, he was made happy not only in other respects, but also because his wife, who was at first barren, was later enabled by God to conceive and bear sons. God left Arabia to Ismail and his posterity, Troglodytes to Abraham's sons by Keturah, and Canaan to Isaac. By God's help, Isaac performed great exploits in war, which they must still remember unless they themselves were impious. As for Jacob, he became known even among strangers because of the greatness of the prosperity in which he lived, and he left that prosperity to his sons, who came into Egypt with no more than 70 souls, while now the Hebrews had become more than 600,000. Know therefore that I will provide for all of you in common what is good for you, and for you in particular what will make you famous. The child whose birth the Egyptians dread, and because of whom they have doomed the Israelite children to destruction, will be this child of yours. He will be hidden from those who watch to destroy him. When he is brought up in a surprising way, he will deliver the Hebrew nation from the distress they suffer under the Egyptians. His memory will be famous as long as the world lasts, not only among the Hebrews, but also among foreigners. All this will be the effect of my favor to you and to your posterity. He will also have such a brother that he himself will obtain my priesthood, and his posterity will have it after him to the end of the world." When the vision had told him these things, Amram awoke and told it to Jocheb his wife. Their fear now increased because of the prediction in Amram's dream, for they were anxious not only about the child, but also about the great happiness that was to come to him. Yet the mother's labor confirmed what God had foretold. Those who watched her did not know it, because her pains were easy and the throes of delivery did not come upon her violently. They privately nourished the child at home for 3 months. After that, Amram feared he would be discovered, and that by falling under the king's displeasure both he and his child would perish, making God's promise of no effect. So he decided it was better to entrust the child's safety and care to God than to rely on his own concealment of him, which he considered uncertain and dangerous both to the child, who was being nourished secretly, and to himself. He believed that God would certainly find some way to secure the child's safety in order to preserve the truth of his own predictions. Having made this decision, they made an ark of bulrushes like a cradle, large enough for an infant to lie in without being cramped. They daubed it with slime, which would naturally keep water from entering between the bulrushes. Then they put the infant into it, set it afloat on the river, and left his preservation to God. The river received the child and carried him along. Miriam, the child's sister, walked along the bank opposite him as her mother had instructed her, to see where the ark would be carried. In this, God showed that human wisdom is nothing, but that the Supreme Being can do whatever he pleases. Those who, for their own security, condemn others to destruction and make great efforts toward it fail in their purpose, while others are surprisingly preserved and gain prosperity almost from the very midst of their calamities, when their dangers arise by God's appointment. Indeed, such providence was exercised in the case of this child as displayed the power of God. Thermuthes was the king's daughter. She was entertaining herself by the banks of the river, and when she saw a cradle carried along by the current, she sent swimmers and ordered them to bring it to her. When those sent on this errand came to her with the cradle, and she saw the little child, she greatly loved him because of his size and beauty. God had taken such great care in forming Moses that he caused him to be thought worthy of being raised and provided for by the very people who, out of fear of his birth, had made the most fatal resolutions for the destruction of the rest of the Hebrew nation. Thermuthes ordered them to bring her a woman who could nurse the child. But the child would not take her breast, and turned away from it, and did the same with many other women. Miriam was present when this happened, not appearing to be there on purpose, but only as though she had stayed to see the child. She told the queen that it was useless to call for these women to nourish the child, since they were in no way related to him. But if she ordered one of the Hebrew women to be brought, perhaps he would take the breast of someone from his own nation. Since this seemed well said, Thermuthes told Miriam to find such a woman and bring one of the Hebrew women who gave suck. When Miriam received this authority, she came back and brought the child's mother, who was known to no one there. The child gladly took the breast and seemed to cling to it. So, at the queen's request, the nursing of the child was entirely entrusted to his mother. Because of what had happened when he was put into the river, Thermuthes gave him the name Mouses. The Egyptians call water Mo, and those saved out of it Uses. By putting the two words together, they gave him this name. By everyone's confession, in accordance with God's prediction, he was the best of all the Hebrews, both in greatness of mind and in contempt of difficulties. Abraham was his ancestor in the 7th generation. Moses was the son of Amram, who was the son of Koth, whose father Levi was the son of Jacob, who was the son of Isaac, who was the son of Abraham. Moses' understanding became greater than his age, indeed far beyond its usual measure. When he was taught, he showed a quicker grasp than was common at that age, and his actions then promised even greater things when he became a man. God also gave him such height, when he was only 3 years old, as was wonderful. As for his beauty, no one was so uncultivated that, on seeing Moses, he was not greatly struck by the beauty of his face. It often happened that people who met him as he was carried along the road were forced to turn back when they saw the child. They left what they were doing and stood still a long time to look at him, for the child's beauty was so remarkable and so natural to him in many ways that it detained the spectators and made them stay longer to gaze on him. Thermuthes, seeing that he was such a remarkable child, adopted him as her son, since she had no child of her own. Once, when she had carried Moses to her father, she showed him to him and said she intended to make him her successor if it should please God that she have no legitimate child of her own. She told the king that she had brought up a child of divine form and generous mind, and that, since she had received him from the bounty of the river, she thought it proper to adopt him as her son and the heir of his kingdom. After saying this, she put the infant into her father's hands. He took him, hugged him to his breast, and for his daughter's sake, pleasantly placed his diadem on the child's head. But Moses threw it down to the ground, and in a childish mood rolled it around and trampled it with his feet. This seemed to carry an evil omen concerning the kingdom of Egypt. When the sacred scribe saw this, the same man who had foretold that Moses' birth would bring down the dominion of that kingdom, he made a violent attempt to kill him. Crying out in a frightening manner, he said that this child, O king, was the one of whom God had foretold that if they killed him, they would be in no danger. He said the child himself gave witness to the same prediction by trampling on the king's government and treading on his diadem. Therefore, he urged the king to take him out of the way, deliver the Egyptians from their fear of him, and deprive the Hebrews of the hope they had of being encouraged by him. But Thermuthes stopped him and snatched the child away. The king was not quick to kill him, because God himself, whose providence protected Moses, inclined the king to spare him. Moses was therefore educated with great care. The Hebrews depended on him and had good hopes that great things would be done by him, while the Egyptians were suspicious of what would follow from his education. Yet because, if Moses were killed, there was no one either related by blood or adopted who had any oracle on his side for claiming the crown of Egypt, and who was likely to be of greater advantage to them, they refrained from killing him. Moses, after being born and brought up in the manner already described, came to mature age and made his virtue clear to the Egyptians. He showed that he had been born to bring them down and to raise up the Israelites. The occasion he seized was this: the Ethiopians, who were the nearest neighbors of the Egyptians, invaded their country, seized it, and carried off the Egyptians' possessions. The Egyptians, in their anger, fought against them and tried to avenge the injuries they had received. But they were defeated in battle. Some were killed, and the rest ran away shamefully, saving themselves by flight. The Ethiopians pursued them, and thinking it would be a sign of cowardice if they did not subdue all Egypt, they pressed on with even greater force to conquer the rest. Once they had tasted the sweetness of the country, they never stopped prosecuting the war. Since the nearest regions at first did not have enough courage to fight them, they advanced as far as Memphis and the sea itself, while not one of the cities was able to resist them. Under this severe oppression, the Egyptians turned to their oracles and prophecies. When God gave them the counsel to make use of Moses the Hebrew and take his assistance, the king commanded his daughter to produce him so that he might become general of their army. After she made the king swear that he would do Moses no harm, she delivered Moses to him, and believed his help would be of great advantage to them. At the same time, she reproached the priest, who had earlier advised the Egyptians to kill Moses and now was not ashamed to admit that they needed his help. So Moses, persuaded both by Thermuthes and by the king himself, cheerfully undertook the task. The sacred scribes of both nations were glad. The Egyptian scribes were pleased because they expected to defeat their enemies by his courage, and by the same plan, to have Moses killed. The Hebrew scribes were glad because they expected to escape from the Egyptians, since Moses was to be their general. But Moses moved before the enemies expected him and led his army out before they were aware of his attack. He did not march by the river, but by land, and there he gave a wonderful proof of his wisdom. The ground was difficult to cross because of the multitude of serpents it produces in vast numbers. That region is indeed remarkable for some such creatures that other countries do not breed, and they are worse than others in power and mischief, and unusual in the fierceness of their appearance. Some of them rise unseen out of the ground and also fly in the air, coming unexpectedly upon men and harming them. Moses invented a wonderful strategy to keep the army safe and unharmed. He made baskets like arks out of sedge, filled them with ibis, and carried them along. This animal is the greatest enemy imaginable to serpents. Serpents flee when ibis come near them, and as they flee, the ibis catch and devour them, as if done by hearts. The ibis are tame creatures, and are enemies only to the serpentine kind. I will say no more about these ibis at present, since the Greeks themselves are not unfamiliar with this kind of bird. As soon as Moses came to the land that bred these serpents, he released the ibis. By their means he drove back the serpentine kind, using them as helpers before the army entered that ground. After proceeding in this way on his journey, Moses came upon the Ethiopians before they expected him. He joined battle with them, defeated them, deprived them of the hopes they had of success against the Egyptians, and continued overthrowing their cities. He also made a great slaughter of the Ethiopians. Once the Egyptian army had tasted this prosperous success through Moses, they did not slacken their diligence. The Ethiopians were in danger of being reduced to slavery and every kind of destruction. At last they withdrew to Saba, a royal city of Ethiopia, which Cambyses later named Miro after his own sister. The place was extremely difficult to besiege. It was surrounded all the way around by the Nile, and the other rivers, Astapus and Astaborus, made it very difficult for anyone attempting to cross them. The city lay in a retired place, and was inhabited like an island. It was surrounded by a strong wall, protected from enemies by the rivers, and had great ramparts between the wall and the rivers. Because of these, even when the waters came with the greatest violence, the city could never be drowned. Those ramparts also made it almost impossible for even those who had crossed the rivers to take the city. Moses was uneasy because the army lay idle, since the enemies did not dare come out to battle. While things were in this condition, an accident occurred. Tharbis was the daughter of the king of the Ethiopians. She happened to see Moses as he led the army near the walls and fought with great courage. She admired the subtlety of his undertakings and believed that he was the cause of the Egyptians' success, when they had previously despaired of recovering their liberty, and also the cause of the great danger now facing the Ethiopians, who had earlier boasted of their great achievements. She fell deeply in love with him. When that passion prevailed over her, she sent the most faithful of all her servants to speak with Moses about marriage. Moses accepted the offer on the condition that she would secure the surrender of the city. He gave her the assurance of an oath that he would take her as his wife, and that, once he had taken possession of the city, he would not break his oath to her. As soon as the agreement was made, it took effect immediately. When Moses had cut off the Ethiopians, he gave thanks to God, consummated his marriage, and led the Egyptians back to their own land. After the Egyptians had been preserved by Moses, they came to hate him. They were very eager to carry out their plans against him, because they suspected that he would use his success as an opportunity to raise a rebellion and bring changes into Egypt. They told the king that Moses ought to be killed. The king also had some intention of doing the same thing, partly from envy of Moses' glorious expedition as leader of the army, and partly from fear that Moses might bring him low. Urged on by the sacred scribes, he was ready to undertake the killing of Moses. But Moses learned beforehand about the plots against him, and he went away secretly. Since the public roads were being watched, he fled through the deserts, where his enemies would not suspect him to travel. Though he had no food, he went on and courageously despised that hardship. When he came to the city Midian, which lay by the Red Sea and was named after one of Abraham's sons by Keturah, he sat down by a certain well. There he rested after his laborious journey and the affliction he had suffered. The well was not far from the city, and it was noon. At that place, by the custom of the country, an occasion was offered to him to do something that displayed his virtue and gave him an opportunity to improve his circumstances. Because that country had little water, the shepherds used to seize the wells before others came, lest their flocks should lack water, or lest the water should be used up by others before they arrived. 7 sisters, all virgins, now came to this well. They were the daughters of Rachel, a priest and a man thought worthy of great honor by the people of the country. These virgins took care of their father's flocks, a kind of work that women in the country of the troglodytes commonly and familiarly perform. They came first and drew enough water from the well for their flocks, putting it into the troughs made to receive it. But when the shepherds came upon the maidens, they drove them away so they could control the water themselves. Moses thought it would be a terrible reproach to him if he overlooked the young women while they were being unjustly oppressed, and if he allowed the violence of the men to prevail over the right of the maidens. So he drove away the men who wanted more than their share, and he gave proper assistance to the women. After receiving this benefit from Moses, the women came to their father and told him how they had been insulted by the shepherds and helped by a stranger. They begged him not to let this generous action be done in vain or go without reward. Their father was pleased that his daughters were so eager to reward their benefactor, and he told them to bring Moses into his presence so he could be rewarded as he deserved. When Moses came, Rachel told him what testimony his daughters had given about how he had assisted them. He said that he admired Moses for his virtue, and that Moses had given his help to people who were not unmindful of benefits, but were both able and willing to return the kindness, and even to exceed the measure of his generosity. So Rachel made Moses his son, gave him one of his daughters in marriage, and appointed him guardian and superintendent over his cattle. In ancient times, all the wealth of the barbarians was in such cattle. After Moses had gained the favor of Jethro, which was one of the names of Rachel, he stayed there and fed his flock. Some time afterward, he took his station at the mountain called Sinai and drove his flocks there to feed them. This was the highest of all the mountains in that region, and the best for pasture, because the grass there was good. It had not previously been fed on because men believed that God dwelt there, and the shepherds did not dare to climb it. There a wonderful prodigy happened to Moses. A fire burned upon a thorn bush, yet the green leaves and the flowers remained untouched, and the fire did not consume the fruit-bearing branches at all, although the flame was great and fierce. Moses was frightened by this strange sight, as it seemed to him, but he was even more astonished when the fire spoke with a voice, called him by name, and addressed him. The voice signified how bold he had been in daring to come into a place where no man had ever come before, because the place was divine. It advised him to move a great distance away from the flame and to be content with what he had seen. Though Moses was a good man and the offspring of great men, he was not to pry any further. The voice foretold that he would have glory and honor among men through God's blessing upon him. It also commanded him to go confidently from there to Egypt, so that he might become the commander and conductor of the body of the Hebrews, and deliver his own people from the injuries they suffered there. God said they would inhabit the happy land, where their forefather Abraham had lived, and would enjoy all good things. Still, God commanded that when Moses brought the Hebrews out of the land of Egypt, they were to come to that place and offer sacrifices of thanksgiving there. Such were the divine oracles delivered from the fire. I think it would be an act of too great madness, O Lord, for someone who holds you in the regard I do to distrust your power, since I myself adore it and know that it was made clear to my forefathers. But I am still in doubt how I, a private man with no abilities, could either persuade my own countrymen to leave the country where they now live and follow me to a land where I lead them, or, if they are persuaded, how I can force Pharaoh to permit them to depart, since the Egyptians increase their own wealth and prosperity by the labors and works they impose on them. God persuaded Moses to be courageous on every occasion, and promised to be with him and to assist him in his words when he had to persuade men, and in his deeds when he had to perform wonders. God also told him to take a sign of the truth of what he said by throwing his rod on the ground. When Moses did this, the rod crept along and became a serpent. It coiled itself in its folds and raised its head, as though ready to revenge itself on anyone who attacked it. Afterward it became a rod again, as it had been before. After this, God told Moses to put his right hand into his bosom. Moses obeyed, and when he took it out, it was white and colored like chalk, but afterward it returned again to its usual color. Also, at God's command, he took some of the water that was near him and poured it on the ground, and he saw that its color was that of blood. When Moses showed wonder at these signs, God urged him to be of good courage and to be assured that he would be his greatest support. He told him to use these signs in order to gain belief among all men that he had been sent by God and did everything according to God's commands. Accordingly, God commanded him to delay no longer, but to hurry to Egypt, to travel night and day, and not to draw out the time and so make the slavery and sufferings of the Hebrews last longer. Moses had now seen and heard these wonders, which assured him of the truth of God's promises, and no room was left for him to disbelieve them. He entreated God to grant him that power when he should be in Egypt. He also begged God to grant him knowledge of his own name. Since Moses had heard and seen him, he asked that God would also tell him his name, so that when he offered sacrifice he might invoke him by that name in his offerings. Thereupon God declared to him his holy name, which had never before been disclosed to men. Concerning this it is not lawful for me to say any more. These signs accompanied Moses not only then, but always whenever he prayed for them. Of all the signs, he gave the firmest assent to the fire in the bush. Believing that God would be a gracious supporter to him, he hoped he would be able to deliver his own nation and bring calamities upon the Egyptians.
And there we will pause, at the foot of the holy mountain, with Moses turned back toward the very Egypt he fled, a staff in his hand that can become a serpent, a brother sent to meet him, and a God who has heard the groaning of a nation. Ahead lies the hardest heart in the ancient world, and the duel of signs and plagues for the freedom of a people. Next time, in Part 4, the close of Book 2, Pharaoh, the 10 plagues, the night of the Passover, and the sea that opens and then closes. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.